con su teléfono ingresen a una sesión de Zoom y utilicen sus audífonos. Entonces, bueno, es la primera vez que hacemos esto y nos ha tomado un tiempito configurarlo, por eso nos estamos tardando. Yo creo que en unos 5 minutos empezamos, pero mientras me serviría mucho saber quién necesita esa traducción y trae sus audífonos y su teléfono y todo eso. Pero tú ya tienes la sesión de Zoom, ¿no? Ya te pasé el vínculo, ¿o no? ¿Alguien más? ¿Tú ya? Bueno, porque si no hay nadie más, hay que empezar. ¿Sí? Bueno. ¿Cómo? Alguien que está en la sala de espera de Zoom. Tienes que admitir. Benjamín Arditi también viene un poquito retrasado, pero no importa porque él conoce la conferencia de Paul, entonces, aunque llegue un poco tarde, vas a ver de qué estamos hablando. Yo creo que vamos a empezar ya, ¿sí?
Ya. Lo único que tiene que pasar es que Ilse se conecte y ellos se metan al canal de Ilse.
Perfecto, muy bien. Quitar. Si alguien está en la sesión de Zoom, quitar el sonido, mute. Uh-huh. Are you ready, Paul?
I'm ready.
Excellent.
Is this good? I turned this sound off.
A ver,
because
talk, and see if,
me. So can you hear
otherwise
me?
you can use one of these.
I can use that. Is this sound okay? But I can't hear if it is or not.
Sí,
This is
funciona el micrófono.
okay.
A mí no me gusta mucho cómo suena, pero I can give you this. Okay, so we're going to start. I am very glad and happy to have Dr. Paul Bowman from the University of Cardiff here at Ibero as our special guest in this seminar, permanent seminar about the destination of the humanities. Paul very kindly wrote a paper especially for our seminar. He has been watching the recordings of our previous sessions, so I am very, very grateful that such an important scholar in the field of cultural studies that has published so many books, not just about theory, but about martial arts, has done this for us. And Paul is going to give a lecture, a keynote speech rather, for about 50 minutes. And then hopefully Benjamin Arditi will join us for, for comments. And we will have about 45 minutes of Q&A. And please feel free to exchange thoughts with our guest, Paul. Thank you very much, Paul. If you need this microphone,
Shall I
if you prefer.
Is this okay?
Yeah.
This works. Okay.
No, but the translator needs to...
So I can use this as well.
Yeah.
Okay,
Because
so
it's
this-
going to translate to the
Yeah.
Zoom.
So okay, I'll use both. That's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. Okay. So buenas tardes. Es un enorme honor estar aquí con ustedes. Me siento muy honrado por la invitación y sumamente contento de poder acompañarles. Quiero agradecer a mis anfitriones, especialmente Gabriela, por su enorme hospitalidad y generosidad. Y les agradezco de antemano su paciencia. Tendré que hablar en inglés y esto me provoca cierta vergüenza. Soy producto de una educación británica obrera en la época postimperial, que es un tipo de educación bastante peculiar. Por un lado, la dimensión postimperial implicaba que aún se asumía que el mundo hablaba inglés. ¿Sí? Like this? Like this. Okay. Que el mundo hablaba inglés. O que todas las personas en el mundo debían hablar inglés. Por otro lado, el componente de clase obrera significaba que yo nunca pensé que llegaría a viajar al extranjero. En la escuela secundaria estábamos obligados a estudiar francés. Pero para mí no tenía sentido que tuviéramos que hacerlo porque nunca pensé que iría a Francia ni a ningún otro lugar. Por eso no tengo palabras para expresar lo sorprendido y encantado que estoy de estar aquí. Sin embargo, no continuaré en español. Sé lo cansado que puede resultar tratar de escuchar a alguien leer en una lengua que en realidad no domina. Así que no voy a imponerles mucho más de mi mal pronunciado español. No obstante, he intentado incluir la mayoría de mis puntos principales en español en las diapositivas de PowerPoint. And also, hopefully, an interpreter. Muchas gracias de nuevo.
Bueno, tenemos un intérprete y entonces,
Sí.
muchas gracias.
I'll wait. Shall I start? Ahora comenzaré.
No, give us 1 minute because...
1 minute.
Yeah.
That's fine. I'll change the slide so you have something to look.
Bueno, falta un minuto, pero creo que voy a cambiar.
Okay, why is... Okay. Yeah? No?
No.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Once more with feeling. Okay, so I am honored to have been invited to contribute to this seminar series on the destination of the humanities. Feedback? Like this. Okay. On the destination of the humanities and in such a STEAM company. In the work of the philosopher Jacques Derrida, the term destination is loaded. Destination is both aim and inevitability. Is it this? Has that stopped? It might be these. Okay. Is this working? I think it might have been these. I think so. Stupid Inglés. Just speak in Spanish. What's the problem? Any questions? Yeah? Shall I just speak in Spanish? Esperanto. Spanglish.
Please, go ahead.
So I start again.
Yes.
I am still honored to have been invited, okay? So in the work of the philosopher Jacques Derrida, the term destination is loaded. Destination is both an aim and inevitability, ambition and oblivion, success and failure, speculation and certainty. The subtitle of this seminar series switches registers: rethinking traditions, reinventing practices. This moves us from philosophical speculation about destination into a more pragmatic realm: rethinking, reinventing, changing, doing. My work has always been in the field of cultural studies, and I know that cultural studies has or had a bad name. It has a bad name in the UK and USA as much as right here, right now. I say it had a bad name because cultural studies, in one sense, has reached its destination, or destinations. It is both success and failure, thriving and dying. But whether we think it is alive or dead, I want to start by trying to persuade you that cultural studies is or was not as bad as you might think it is or was. In fact, I will argue that when viewed from a certain perspective, you probably do a version of cultural studies yourself. This is because cultural studies, at least in its early invention by figures like the British Jamaican public intellectual Stuart Hall, had a deep investment in the idea of intervention, in cultural politics and in cultural agency, especially related to class, race, ethnicity, and then gender. In fact, race, class, gender has been called the holy trinity of cultural studies. Because of this, I will argue, the post-Gramscian political theory of hegemony and articulation, as developed by Ernesto Laclau in the 1970s, was fundamental and foundational for cultural studies. Politics is at the heart, but it is not the sole focus of cultural studies. I will illustrate this by way of thinking about a stick. We brought one as well, but we should just think about it. Okay? I will argue that many academic theories or paradigms have almost nothing to say about a stick, and that this is a problem or a challenge, because there are some ways in which supposedly insignificant little things like sticks can be understood to be very important. I will argue that the famous or infamous conceptual and institutional messiness of cultural studies, its disciplinary openness, allows one to be open to finding new ways and new reasons to study new things. In the past, cultural studies' open-endedness and messiness was regarded by many as a weakness, but by some as a virtue. Some even compared it to Emmanuel Levinas's philosophy of openness to the other, or even Jacques Derrida's philosophy of hospitality. In practical terms, cultural studies was arguably an early advocate of interdisciplinarity, or at least of eclectic mixed methods approaches to research and study. Some even argued that cultural studies should be regarded as anti-disciplinary, and that this was a large part of its value, or definitive of cultural studies as an intervention. I myself went on to coin the portmanteau word alterdisciplinarity to name this logic of intervention. Cultural studies seeks to alter disciplinarity because the disciplines are key nodes in the networks of power and knowledge. Others have argued that cultural studies is post-disciplinary. I will also propose today that whatever remains of cultural studies as a distinct identity can be described as involving porterdisciplinarity, or the Lego-like plugging together of portable elements in the study of more or less any object, combining more or less any theory with more or less any methodology. On the one hand, I argue this is the death of cultural studies, but on the other hand, it is also a necessary pragmatic survival response. Cultural studies has had to change in order to survive. It has often had to shed its skin, change its shape, abandon its name. To use an image that Slavoj Žižek has used a lot, sometimes in order to survive, you have to strike at yourself, relinquish your former identity. This has happened quite a lot with cultural studies. Cultural studies degrees in the UK are now not as popular as they once were with students. The name does not attract the numbers needed for survival in the neoliberal university. Cultural studies degrees have closed down, but this does not simply mean the sacking of staff or closing of departments. Rather, it means precisely rethinking practices and reinventing traditions, rebranding, retooling, identity work. If any terms have replaced cultural studies in the degree shopping market, it has to be cultural industries and creative industries. Cultural studies shelters under these new marketable terms, for of course all good cultural studies program, cultural industries programs should include what many of us would recognize as fairly bog standard cultural studies or cultural theory modules. At Cardiff University, that's my place, we fought over who owned the word culture for a long time. My school, then called the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies, eventually won the word culture. We finally established an undergraduate degree in cultural studies. But when we did that, applications actually fell. We were too late. Eventually we abandoned the term altogether, renamed our degrees, and even renamed ourselves. We became the School of Journalism, Media and Culture. The very year that I was promoted to culture, and we decided that my title should be Professor of Cultural Studies, because it could have been Professor of Media Studies, or was the exact same time that we closed our degrees in Cultural Studies and dropped Cultural Studies from our school's name. I was fine with this. In fact, I don't think anyone had been more vocal than me in arguing that we needed to ditch the term Cultural Studies. I knew its heyday had passed. Today, people are wondering whether another heyday has passed, the heyday of the humanities themselves. In the face of the explosion of AI over the past few years, people in the humanities are feeling an existential threat. At the end of my presentation, I will try to reposition AI's many threats and risks to the humanities as challenges that do not mean death or the final destination, but rather as challenges that demand a pragmatic, ethical, and creative response. So, to begin again. I better leave it there because it's not working. If I turn that... Come on, you can do it. You can read that. It's in English. Cultural studies is not the frivolous, light-hearted, trivial thing that the media and other academic disciplines sometimes think that it is, nor is it an unserious or stupid thing. Rather, cultural studies is almost always orientated and animated by questions of ethics and politics. This is as true in its studies of supposedly trivial things like fashion or pop music or shopping as it is in its studies of, say, global migration, war, incarceration, or environmental destruction. Cultural studies is a broad church. You can, almost by definition, take pretty much anything as your object of study. But this comes with some caveats and obligations. Within the British tradition of cultural studies that I see myself as part of, one's orientation must always be, in some sense, ethical or political. A cultural studies approach to, say, fashion or TV or music or magazines or whatever other supposedly trivial thing must normally be focused on ethical and political questions, issues of representational bias, ideology, ethnic, gender, sexual or cultural hierarchies, and so on. Cultural studies used to be one of the few academic spaces, perhaps the only academic space, in which taking non-canonical subjects and exploring them in their ideological, ethical, and political dimensions was accepted. However, this was so successful that by the late 20th century, more and more spaces across the arts, humanities, and social sciences started to follow suit. This is what I meant when I said at the start that, in fact, you probably do a version of cultural studies yourself. Historically, cultural studies was the place where the ethical, political, and ideological dimensions of implicitly anything could be studied. This was so successful that cultural studies became a victim of its own success. For, to put it bluntly, when everyone across the arts and humanities ended up basically doing cultural studies, when cultural studies turned out to have been the destination of the humanities, then where did that leave actual cultural studies? Everywhere and yet nowhere. In the UK, this has been compounded by the structuring forces not only of neoliberalism in the form of the removal of government funding for arts and humanities programs, but also by the reorienting power of what is known as the UK's Research Excellence Framework, or REF. The REF is ostensibly a census that measures the quality of the research outputs and activities of British university departments. However, it also rewards or penalises those departments based on the scores they get. Just in time for the REF discussion. Benjamin. So, the REF is the very exemplification of Michel Foucault's notion of panoptical power, a means of observation that changes the behaviour of those being observed. REF results determine the amount of research funding that departments are given. The last REF in 2021 allocated approximately £15 billion of government research funding to participating UK universities over the 2022 to 2029 period. For the single academic year of 2024 to 25, Cardiff University was allocated £28.1 million of funding because of its REF 2021 results. No one seems to know or can't or won't tell me exactly what my own school receives each year, but an AI service online estimated that it might be about £1 million per annum. I asked my school manager, how much money did we get from the REF? She was like, oh, I don't know. So I said, can you find out? And she asked, like, the college accountant. Silence. I think we may be, if I vanish for asking the wrong questions, you know what's happened. Yeah, bizarre. It would be good if this slide changed. Okay, that's not the one. This one. Okay. So I mention all of this because part of REF panopticism is not only the injunction to publish highly rateable research outputs, it is also what is called impact. Research activity must aspire to make an impact. That is, it must strive to make an intervention into the outside world, the world outside the university. Falling into line with this injunction, the majority of the other UK research funding councils also make impact a more and more important consideration. Stated bluntly, if your academic project does not also promise to make a measurable difference in the outside world, you are not going to get that grant. Okay. No. No. Yes. Okay. When viewed in one kind of historical perspective, even this is arguably a peculiar kind of cultural studies effect. As I proposed in my 2003 collection, Interrogating Cultural Studies, and argued in my 2007 book, Post-Marxism versus Cultural Studies, and again in Deconstructing Popular Culture, and again in numerous further articles at that time, one of the defining characteristics of cultural studies in the past had always been its hitherto relatively unique commitment to what I called intervention. This, I argued, was a core characteristic of cultural studies. However, as a consequence of the neoliberalisation of British education, the power of the REF, and a mutation in research council funding values, that uniqueness has vanished. Now it's not just cultural studies that must seek to intervene, it's everyone. It used to be publish or perish. Now it is also make a difference or perish. Nonetheless, I have often secretly thought that those of us who identified with the tradition of British cultural studies should really, in some sense, actually welcome the impact dimension of the research excellence framework. This is not to say that I think that cultural studies should passively align with the dominant lines of force structuring UK academic institutions, but rather that it is at least a bit like what cultural studies seemed to say it wanted, the valuing of intervention. To be clear, many of my cultural studies colleagues in the UK would disagree with what I have just said. And in a way, rightly so. The REF is a highly bureaucratic and arguably unfair and biased imposition. But I still think that something about its demands for impact shares something with a cultural studies desire for intervention. My first monograph was called Post-Marxism versus Cultural Studies. In that book, I argued that cultural studies has always been mobilized by the idea of academic work as an intervention, and especially the idea of political intervention, that it has always focused on, looked for, or argued for the political dimensions of things. The political, for cultural studies, has long been a raison d'être or a raison de ser. Yet it always also refused to become political studies per se. This is because cultural studies refuses the obligation only to study things that seem self-evidently political. Scholars like Gary Hall and Joanna Zielinska have theorized this as a radical openness to the undecidability of what might turn out to be political or to have been political, rather than the predetermination of what should be a proper or legitimate object of attention. Earlier cultural studies had long argued for what is now probably too easily called decolonizing the curriculum. Do you have that? You have to decolonize everything. Okay. In literary studies, if all of your canonical authors are dead white men, you have to ask why. In history, if all your knowledge is about the rich and powerful, you have to ask why. In sociology, if the non-white or non-hegemonic groups are regarded as problems or aberrations from a norm, you have to ask why. Similarly, in the study of culture, if some things are deemed high culture and hence worthy of attention, but other things are deemed low culture and hence not worthy of attention, you have to ask what is going on there too. Cultural studies has not been alone in theorizing all of this as political, but to use a political theory distinction, not politics, but still political. Okay, you're going to change? No? No? That's not the slide we want, is it? We want that slide soon, but we'll have these first. For the last 20 years or so, I've mainly studied and written about the supposedly trivial matters of martial arts in media and culture. Although on the one hand, I was self-consciously creating the interdisciplinary field of martial arts studies, I also regarded this very much as a cultural studies project. For me, it never stopped being cultural studies, and I tried to create martial arts studies as an interdisciplinary field that was organized by many of the same questions, concerns, attitudes, and openness as cultural studies. I don't know if I succeeded, but that's what I tried to do. For me, martial arts studies was pretty much the expansion of cultural studies into a new discursive space. And it was also an intervention. And yes, I gained some funding. The specific nature of my first award was a research networking grant, focusing on bringing academic scholars and non-academic practitioners together into the same spaces. In British Research Council terms, this is called a pathway to impact. It is the intervention of academic work into a non-academic or public space. Whether we think this kind of intervention is ethical or political or not depends on our understanding of ethics and politics. Inventing martial arts studies is certainly not like mobilizing a large body of people into a collective force that changes government policy or law, but it is linking academics and practitioners and hence changing wider discourses on martial arts. We also published open access and set up a free podcast. We did this so that the knowledge generated could intervene into broader scenes and impact on beliefs, ideologies, and practices. We published works of myth-busting, ideology critique, gender politics, anti-Orientalism, and so on. So in terms of both academic and practitioner discourse, martial arts studies constituted an intervention that could be called ethical, at least if there is an ethical obligation to further historical knowledge rather than myth, and political, at least if there is a politics to the reorganization of what institutions like the university say and do, and if university work impacts on what people say, think, and do. Certainly this is not politics writ large or capital P politics. This is minor politics or discursive politics. To phrase it like this is to point to why the political theory developed by Ernesto Laclau in the 1970s and 1980s was so helpful to cultural studies. Laclau's work theorized the social and political as constituted through discourses. Sometimes discourses are heavily anchored in and by institutional or nodal points. Sometimes they are shifting. Practices and indeed objects were theorized by Laclau as attaining meaning, significance, and force by way of what they were articulated with, that is, connected to, linked up with, across contexts and over time. In short, Laclau, and later Laclau and Mouffe, argued a fully fleshed out theory of cultural politics, of how and why culture can be regarded as part of politics. However, there is more to culture, and indeed to cultural studies, than a fixation on politics and the political. Politics and political theory is at the heart of at least one tradition of cultural studies, but it is not the limit of cultural studies. In fact, a political studies paradigm arguably has some distinct limits and blindnesses that can hinder cultural studies. So cultural studies arguably exceeds political studies in this respect, although it always also has its own paradigm limits of its own. To illustrate what I mean, let's introduce my example. Let's think about something that is clear and simple, something we can all imagine. How about a stick? If you can't imagine one, they look like this. Right? Stay. How about a stick? Okay. Or a staff. This is a staff. Think about a staff. A long staff, a quarter staff, which is even longer than this, a bow staff, which this is, a joe staff, which is smaller, a lovely, smooth, hardwood staff. Imagine grasping it in your hands. Imagine the feel of it, the weight, its finish. That's our example right there, a lovely, long stick. What can political theory tell us or help us think about a stick or a staff? The holding of it, the wielding of it, its effects or affects on us, on our identity, on those around us, and so on. Laclauian discourse theory would have to look around and find ways that the stick is part of a discourse. Once it has found the way that it is articulated to or with something else, then away we go in the Laclauian interpretation machine. If I wield my stick, like others wield their sticks, then I am articulated with them and part of a discourse. From there, we can look at the different values and identifications of the macro and micro practices, and we can start to interpret or diagnose me and my stick in larger political and ideological terms. And I'm fine with this. I agree with this. But the practitioner in me, the person who has trained martial arts and other exercise styles with sticks and clubs, which are different, feels that there is so much more to think and feel and say and write about this, about the hand-stick nexus, the human prosthesis machine. So put bluntly, neither Ernesto Laclau nor Stuart Hall would have much of value or interest to say about any of this. I doubt Laclau ever cared intellectually about anything that was not in some way directly aligned with a leftist political project. And as far as I'm aware, the most that Stuart Hall ever said about exercise was that exercise culture and those who invested in it is all aligned with neoliberalism. So we need to look around and see what other theorists and thinkers and approaches might suggest about it. So this is what I do. This is what drives my intellectual and theoretical development, or my explorations. Just thinking about how to think about the body-stick nexus, for instance, led me to the work of thinkers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Deleuze and Guattari, Yves Kosofsky-Sedgwick, and many others, most recently Alfonso Lingis. Many of these are scholars and approaches that I've known something about for many years, but it was only when I felt a real reason, a real imperative, coming from a force out there in the real world, or in this case, from the interface of an outside force and the inside forces of my lived bodily experience, that I ever had a real compulsion and even a real ability to read new theories or new thinkers. Until something new in me is called by some kind of punctum or snared by some kind of lure, I struggle to read new theories. I've had arguments with my peers in the past. People have argued that I should read so-and-so author and that I have to read such and such theory, and I've said no. I will read it when the world shows me why I should, when there is some kind of opening in me. Back when I was a PhD student, or shortly after, I can't remember, there was a huge conference organized by my peers at my department at my university. The keynote speaker was Alfonso Lingis. At that time, the only questions that concerned me were questions of cultural studies and post-Marxism, questions of antagonism and articulation and hegemony and intervention. I sat through Lingus's keynote and could not grasp a single word of it. It meant nothing to me. I could not hear it. 25 years later, I was speculatively scanning a work on object-oriented ontology, looking for clues about how to make sense of things like holding wooden sticks and staffs, kettlebells, clubs, maces, gathers, weights. The author mentioned something that Alfonso Lingus had apparently once said about good French wine in proper wine glasses generating some kind of imperative about how to consume them properly, how to handle the glass, how to drink the wine, even what to have with the wine. This sounded preposterous to me, but also intriguing, so I set off in search of the original source to find out more. I couldn't get hold of the original source immediately, so I read any Lingus texts I could find. This was the first essay I found. After reading this first essay, which was online, I fell in love with Alfonso Lingus. From being utterly unintelligible and inscrutable to me, I finally found a way into the text, thanks not only to some chance reading encounters, but also to the physical experience of holding sticks that I was presently trying to find words to express. Now, I suspect that if I were working in political studies, or driven solely by the requirement that my object of study be self-evidently political, I may never have arrived here. The conceptual and institutional messiness, the ethical hospitality or disciplinary openness of cultural studies allows one to be open to finding new ways to study new things and new things in new ways. In the past, cultural studies made a lot of noise about being interdisciplinary. This was at a time when disciplinarity was king and being multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary felt subversive or sacrilegious. There's been much reflection on disciplinarity within cultural studies. Is it disciplinary, interdisciplinary, post-disciplinary, or what? John Mowat once argued that both post-structuralism and implicitly cultural studies were, and should always insist on being, anti-disciplinary. I tend to think my journeys and my approaches are anti-disciplinary in this sense. Let me explain the difference between anti-disciplinarity and the dominant kind of porta-disciplinarity that I mentioned before. Let's say I'm supervising a student dissertation. Students come to me with their ideas. I guide them towards viable research questions, a demarcated study, and a manageable methodology. Put differently, I essentially perform the role that Jacques Rancière called that of the ignorant schoolmaster. I never position myself as the expert. I never pretend to know. All I do is tell them what needs to be present in a dissertation. When they have done it, I interrogate the results and verify that it looks watertight. Jacques Rancière theorized this as a kind of emancipatory pedagogy. It is commonplace today. I think of it as porta-disciplinarity. Porta-disciplinarity is portable disciplinarity. I call it porta-disciplinarity because the anthropologist Thomas Xordas argued that the things that can travel most easily across cultures are portable practices with transposable messages. In my experience, all elements of university-level work today are portable. You or I and our students can pick pretty much any object or topic. We just need to pitch our study in a way that makes most sense in terms of the dominant problematics and aesthetics, or indeed structures of feeling, of our particular discipline or field. In the arts and humanities, this is most likely going to be exploring something's political dimensions. Next, we need our theoretical perspectives. There are plenty of these. We can either use the ones that our professors or our preferred journals like the most, or we can shop around. Then there is the literature review. Thanks first to digital databases, and most recently to AI, this can be planned out and even executed in minutes. When I'm on Facebook now, it's just pitching this stuff. Do your literature review in a second. Just do it. It'll be a shit one, but it'll do it for you. Something that could have taken months can now be fleshed out in hours. Then there are the methods. You can ask the internet or AI what research methods have been used to study your chosen topic, and you can pick and mix from them. The internet can give you an overview and point you to what you need to read or watch or copy and paste in order to learn and apply the methodology, and so on. So you might study something from media culture using a theory from anthropology or geography and a method from ethnography or sociology. This is porterdisciplinarity. It is not anti-disciplinarity. And this on the screen is an AI-generated slide. Just so you know. Full ethical declaration. To say more about anti-disciplinarity, let's return to the question of the destination of the humanities. I think that if we were standing in the 1960s asking about the destination of radical theory and anarchic interdisciplinary approaches in 2026, I don't know whether we would be delighted or disappointed to see the mainstreaming of these once radical elements. We might be pleased about the desedimentation of the disciplines and the expansion of interdisciplinarity and maybe even post-disciplinarity or porterdisciplinarity. We might be pleased that politics is the center of so much work in the humanities. We might be perturbed by the emergence and direction of AI. These were all the AI slides that it offered me when I uploaded my first draft of this talk, right? There is a lot of hysteria about AI. It is having many effects. I don't need to dwell on too many of them. Most infamously to date, the University of California system simultaneously closed programs and laid off staff at the same time as investing huge amounts of money in AI systems. Universities often seem to force AI on staff and students without even asking. Universities even pay for AI services that staff and students as individuals could already get for free. Then, when students and their teachers start to allow AI to do their work for them, which seems to be the whole point, there is a moral panic. Then, the same companies who produced the problem of AI plagiarism offer to sell us the solution in the form of AI detection software, which is classic marketing. That's, you create the need and then you create the problem. And this is a race to the bottom. And it's one that we do not need to compete in. AI need not mean the end of the humanities, the end of teachers, or the end of authentic research. It may well mean the end of some things, and God knows I am aware of this. My own wife's company has been destroyed by AI, like many small businesses in the entire sector she was working in. I know AI is wreaking havoc and violently restructuring economic ecosystems. But within the humanities, there are many ways to respond, and we should respond in many ways. To get towards my conclusion, I want to share with you one single response, one among many possible, that I have used to respond to AI. What was most surprising about it, the main reason I give this example, was that it also liberated some hitherto blocked anti-disciplinary trajectories within the arts and humanities themselves. Back in April 2025, I realized that everything I asked my students to do could easily be done by AI. I also established that because of the almost geologically slow bureaucracy of my university, we could not just change our assessments. It can take up to 12 months of paper pushing to change assessments. And even then, it still might not be approved. You just can't change assessments. So knowing that I could not substantially change any of my assessments, while also knowing that AI could do any standard essay for students, I made it my focus to work out how to limit the risk of my students being alienated from their own education. I decided not to hide from AI, but to fully embrace it, to grab hold of it and explore its capacities, much as I would grab hold of and explore the feel and force of my stick, to see what it promised, and whether it could deliver on that promise in order to work out how to work with, through, around, and beyond it. I know my own position is comparatively privileged. I teach pretty high-achieving students how to study media, film, and culture in a quite rich, although atrophying money, university. But I think that the general direction of my approach can be transferred to other contexts. What I did was this. Rather than asking students to do dry analyses of specific media texts or issues, I asked them to reflect on their relationship with a film, program, game, song, video, practice, or whatever. I asked them how learning about or engaging with a specific cultural theory on my module had changed or affected their relationship with their example. And crucially, I invited them to write in more or less any writing style they wanted to try: confessional, first person, autoethnographic, fictional or dramatic, perhaps staging an imaginary discussion between, say, a film director and a film theorist, and so on. I said they could mix styles, poetic or dramatic moments mixed with regular analysis, and I asked for 3 appendices, one discussing any AI use, its values and limitations, another listing what commands and queries were given to which AI, and a third which provided evidence of process, a timeline, a diary, screenshots of notes, anything to demonstrate human involvement. I said I would reward evidence of intellectual struggle, confusion about concepts or theories, discussions of dead ends, changes of mind, and so on. I also said that 60% of their references must come from Cardiff University Library. Most AIs cannot access university libraries, except, of course, the AI services provided by universities themselves. And finally, and above all else, I said that whatever they submitted to me, it must not be written in the style of AI output. Perplexity has a style, Google Notebook LM has a style, they all have a style, and I told them that their work must not look like an AI style. Of course, I knew there are AI writing tools that disguise AI writing, but in any case, I said that I would never accuse them of abusing AI or of cheating. Rather, if it looked like AI, then that by default meant that it was going to be of shoddy word salad quality. I would never mark them down for using AI. I would mark them down for presenting me with sloppy word salad sophistry. My organizing principles were simple. Crucially, first, try to make them want to do this. Everyone wants to talk about themselves, right? Me is the most interesting topic in the world. Second, make it more hassle to use AI to cheat than just to engage with the task authentically or sincerely. The results were great. Students tried out different styles, dramatic approaches, writing with and about indecision, uncertainty, reflecting on their process, reflecting on AI. Obviously, many students had to write standard essays. International students, for example, whose first language is not English, have only ever learned how to write in English in a formal essay style. That's fine. I didn't penalize it. I could say more about all of this later if you want, but for now, to conclude, let me tie this to some larger debates. Back in the early 1990s, the post-colonial literary scholar Robert J.C. Young wrote an essay about the twists and turns of the discourse on university education in England since the 1800s. He was writing in the immediate aftermath of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's attack on the arts and humanities, in which she framed them as useless. This was the moment we would now call the birth of the neoliberalization of UK university education. I do not have time to walk through Robert Young's brilliant analysis of this history, but let me merely say that in Britain, tell me if it's true in Mexico too, debates around university education have always been framed as a zero-sum game in a polemic between usefulness and uselessness, or, if not uselessness, then something else, something higher, something noble, or more recently, something supposedly radical. As a deconstructive scholar, Young cuts through the binary useful versus useless. The polemical formulation of useful versus useless, he argues, is not a formulation we should accept. To enter into that conflict by resisting one value with the other is to remain blind to the extent to which they are inter-implicated, he argues. In concluding, he says, the question today's philosophers therefore need to ask is this: in what ways and with what effects can the university, both inside and outside the market economy, useful and useless, function as a surplus that economy cannot comprehend. For a long time, this challenge was enigmatic to me. I didn't really know what it could mean. However, quite recently I was involved in 2 research projects. You know them both. The first was researching ways to think and write about training with sticks and other kinds of exercise. The second was working out ways to save my students from being alienated from their own education by AI. As part of the first project, I found myself looking into the details of Raymond Williams's famous concept or notion or phrase, structures of feeling. Different kinds of exercise seem to have different structures of feeling, right? So I thought that this notion could help me. So I turned to the writings of my friend Ben Highmore, who's researched and written extensively on the cultural studies of everyday life, including detailed studies of scholars such as Michel de Certeau and Raymond Williams. In scouring Highmore's work, I encountered an essay called Aesthetic Matters, Writing and Cultural Studies. In this essay, published in 2018, long before AI came onto the agenda, Highmore discusses the institution of the standard academic undergraduate essay. This is a genre of writing, a contingent and arguably arbitrary, or at least revisable institution. Why is it so hegemonic? Why do we assume that it is necessary? Why do we value it? What else could be valued? What other writing styles? What do they offer? In his essay, Highmore himself uses different writing styles, a straightforward academic style, ethnographic or anthropological thick description, historical reflection, and so on. I set this article as reading for my students. The ones who read it absolutely loved it. I suggested that they use it as a kind of model or inspiration for their own creativity. Some did. The results were really heartening. To me, this points to one little way in which we, in the humanities, in cultural studies and other fields, might be able to produce forms of surplus that things like the economy cannot comprehend. Surplus, economy, comprehend. All of these terms have many meanings. And of course, what may exceed comprehension in one way may be totally comprehended in another. Our degrees still draw students because they still seem exciting and stimulating to young adults, especially when compared to the more obviously vocational courses that parents and governments keep telling them they really should be doing. Even if this cannot be formally comprehended by the discourse of usefulness, it is still, of course, comprehended by the economy. Most UK students are fee-paying. They bring money into the neoliberal university. They accrue huge debt, borrowing from the future, whether fantasizing about an idyllic final destination or hiding from the future, either way, producing a debt-ridden one, the very business model of neoliberal economics. But there are different kinds of surplus, different kinds of destination. Jacques Derrida spoke of destinerrance, destination errance. Let me put it this way. If I was a destination of AI in the recent past, what did AI do to me? What did I do to it? First, AI changed me. It has made me no longer feel much compulsion to read things that are not literary. It can summarize every fact, argument, or concept, yet it cannot capture and convey that certain something, that surplus, that one encounters when reading a novel or an author like Jacques Derrida. This surplus is related to that which exceeds the literal conceptual signified. To use the terms of Ray Chow's reading of Walter Benjamin's argument about translation, AI can perhaps translate at the level of the signified, but it cannot translate at the textual level of the structure of feeling or of affect or even of the signifier as such. I have not read any satisfactory AI summary of the work of, say, Alfonso Lingus that is in any way able to capture or convey anything at all of the texture, the richness, the surplus of its writing. What this means for me is that if I can use an AI summary of something, then I probably will. I will use it to summarize meetings and write menial reports and things like that. I also use it to pre-summarize things that I still intend to read, so I have a provisional sense of the text's direction and destination. Because of all of this, I think at present that the future of the humanities, at least its next stop or station, if not its final destination, will involve a re-engagement with the literary and aesthetic. This will not be the same as the study of literature and aesthetics before the hegemony of cultural studies and the emergence of AI. As Marshall McLuhan saw it, the emergence of an epochal new technology that makes a former one technically obsolete does not mean that the older technology dies out. Rather, it is revalued, translated, retooled, aestheticized. This is what AI is doing in relation to me, my reading, my teaching, and my assessments. So does this mean I am therefore championing elitism, revaluing the literary, high art, complexity? Will the humanities become an elite preserve once more? Were they ever not? Conversely, or at the same time, will there be a Gramscian or Laclauian upswell against the hegemony of big tech? I expect so. But there are already and also minor ways of working that do not rely solely on what Benjamin Arditi once called polemicization. One thing that martial arts has taught me, with or without sticks, is not to resist force with force. Rather, you need to comprehend the force, to work with it and around it, to generate a surplus force that unbalances, that disrupts, that intervenes at weak points. Many successful combative engagements are defined not by force beating force, but by exceeding otherwise, by producing a surplus that cannot be comprehended by the other. As Bruce Lee said, like water. Water can crash or it can flow, he said. It can also erode, rot, undermine, transform. The destination of a tiny leak may be to become a massive transformation, like cultural studies, like the humanities. Maybe the humanities need to learn from Bruce Lee and be more like water.
Hola.
Hola. Sí, nada más tienes que acercarlo un poco.
Primero que nada, perdón por la hora. El Uber no tenía tag.
First of all, sorry for the hour. My Uber had
No, stop, just stop now.
El Uber no tenía tag. Y por si fuera poco, era un inútil el chofer. Y después de estar perdidos durante meses.
Really nice.
She's doing that for me, so she can stop.
Pero hay que decirle, porque ella
Tell the
no...
interpreter to stop.
¿Está aquí afuera o qué?
That's for my benefit.
You can speak in English.
No, speak in Spanish. Spanish. Speak in Spanish.
Y por si fuera poco, el taxista era un incompetente. Así que tuve, después de estar perdido media hora... Llegó un momento que frente a la náhuac tuve que bajarme del taxi y esperar otro taxi, que él sí tenía el tag y le tuve que pagar en efectivo por el tag para llegar hasta acá. Perdón. ¿Ahí ya no está? Ok, esta es la parte de introducción, pero también hay una parte... ¿Esto no funciona? ¿Funciona o no? All together now? Perdón, ofrecí hablar en español porque estamos en un país que habla español. Puedo hablar en inglés con Paul, pero si hay un servicio de traducción, prefiero hablar en español. Conozco el trabajo de Paul hace mucho tiempo. Somos amigos desde hace por lo menos 25 años. He leído varias de sus cosas. Soy miembro de su consejo de redacción de una serie de libros que produce. Y esto me gustó, aunque claro, al igual que muchos de los que están acá, menos Emilio, no van a entender la relación entre estudios culturales y, no sé, jiu-jitsu, kendo o alguna otra arte marcial. El que se encarga de explicar eso es Paul, que es Mr. Artes Marciales, dado que él es el que introdujo esa interfaz entre artes marciales y estudios culturales. Lo que me gustó mucho de que haya insistido Paul en su texto es dos cosas, y después voy a venir ya con el bate de béisbol para comentarlo. Las dos cosas que me interesan, una es que hable de que los estudios culturales siempre tienen que verse como intervenciones ético-políticas. Lo digo porque para mucha gente que no hace estudios culturales, lo ético y lo político es algo que no tiene nada que ver con la gente que está reflexionando acerca del lugar del otro en el mundo y compañía. Nos dice, por ejemplo, que las preguntas éticas y políticas que se hacen en los estudios culturales son el sesgo que tiene la representación, los sesgos de la ideología y las jerarquías en las cuales vivimos, que son étnicas, de género, sexuales y culturales. Entonces está muy bien que nos hable que hay una dimensión de intervención. Ahora, lo que me saca me desestabiliza un poco es cuando él habla del REF, que son estos mecanismos de evaluación de cada 5 años en el Reino Unido, every 5 years, REF. Bueno, aprox 5, 6, 7, usan la palabra impacto. No es simplemente que tengas que publicar, sino que tu trabajo tenga impacto. Y claro, uno dice, ¿qué impacto puede tener hablar sobre el concepto de dialéctica en Hegel comparado con la forma como lo usa alguien como Althusser? Pero está muy bien que Paul haya recogido algo que es problemático para los estudios culturales, que es el hecho de que una lógica 100% neoliberal, que es medir el impacto de lo que tú estás escribiendo, no importa el campo que sea, realmente le está hablando al concepto de intervención de los estudios culturales. Ahora, Paul no problematizó mucho eso porque no tenía tiempo de hacerlo, pasó a otros temas, pero sí me interesa ver esta idea del interviene o muere, intervene or perish, que tiene un parecido de familia con la idea de que los estudios culturales sí tienen que ver con hacer una intervención en el mundo que nos rodea. La tercera y última cosa que me parecía interesante entre las muchas cosas, cuatro, muchas cosas que dice es que las artes marciales también implican una dimensión ética y política, aunque en la presentación de Paul no lo desarrolló mucho, y tal vez podría Paul hablar un poco de la relación que hay entre estudios culturales e intervenciones políticas. Y la última cosa es este juego que hace entre lo interdisciplinario, lo antidisciplinario, lo postdisciplinario, este concepto de lo portadisciplinario. ¿Se acuerdan con los legos que estaba presentando? Y por último, un cierto anarquismo metodológico que está relacionado con los estudios culturales. No respetar muchísimo, o sea, no prestar demasiada atención a las fronteras disciplinarias. Y conversando sobre esto, Paul ya sabe más o menos los puntos que voy a plantear. Conversando sobre esto le dije que esto me recordó a dos autores. Uno es Paul Feyerabend, que nadie lee hoy en día, que hace 50 años escribió un libro que se llamó Contra el método, y el subtítulo es Para una teoría anarquista del conocimiento, que para gente como yo fue muy decisivo para romper con esta idea de que hay un método, hay que buscarlo, hay que llegar a la verdad. Usa ejemplos maravillosos que no los voy a mencionar. Y el segundo autor que yo asocio con esta idea de, porque lo de Feyerabend tiene que ver con este enfoque anarquista y la portadisciplinaridad. El segundo autor que asocia con esto es la famosa frase de Michel Foucault en la microfísica, donde dice que para mí la teoría es una caja de herramientas. Dependiendo de lo que estoy haciendo, tomo prestado de una, tomo prestado del otro, muy parecido a lo que Lévi-Strauss llamaba el trabajo del bricoleur, el tipo que va mezclando cosas continuamente para crear algo nuevo. Esas serían las cosas que me hablaron a mí. Ahora, me pidieron que, más que un comentario de lo que diga Paul, nos trencemos en algún tipo de discusión, algo de polémica, que algunas cosas le pueden afectar a él, pero muchas cosas tienen que ver con gente que él ha cuestionado. Por ejemplo, el trabajo de la Chloe Mouffe en su libro Hegemony, pero es Cultural Studies versus Postmarxism. Yes. El postmarxismo contra los estudios culturales, y donde postmarxismo sería el trabajo de la Chloe Mouffe de 1985. Es difícil, no sé qué familiaridad tienen con ese libro, pero es muy difícil explicar el impacto que tuvo en estos 40 años. Hice un ejercicio muy sencillo. Entré a Google académico y coloqué hegemonía y estrategia socialista. 29.000 citas. Yo en toda mi vida no tendré 29.000 citas. Eso es un libro de 2 autores, pero después cada uno siguió produciendo por su cuenta. Pero les da la idea del impacto que tuvo. Todos lo usaron, estudios culturales, etc. Tanto es así que Paul habla de que hay una sagrada trinidad de los estudios culturales que tiene que ver con clase, género y raza. Y luego, en otra parte de su intervención, dice que la Chloe Mouffe, en su libro Hegemonía y Estrategia Socialista, ofrecieron una teoría de los estudios culturales. Ahora, no sé lo que piensa mi amigo, pero eso de decir que ofrecieron una teoría de los estudios culturales es justamente lo que a mí me causa problemas. Spoiler alert, yo hice mi doctorado con la Chloe. Spoiler alert, yo no soy laclauiano, yo no trabajo teoría del discurso. Pero Laclau fue uno de los pensadores políticos, para mí por lo menos, más importantes de la segunda mitad del siglo XX. A muchos de nosotros nos ayudó a entender tantas cosas. Pero, y Laclau y Mouffe se consideran, por lo menos en el mundo anglosajón, como casi sinónimos de postmarxismo. Hay otros autores, Michael Hart y Tony Negri, pueden ser postmarxistas, también podríamos pensar en Lyotard y compañía, pero en general uno piensa en postmarxismo en el mundo anglosajón y aparecen los nombres de Laclau y Mouffe. ¿Por qué me problematiza eso? Porque una de las cosas extraordinarias que hacen en este libro es tratar de liberar el marxismo de 2 de sus problemas fundamentales, que son el determinismo económico y el reduccionismo de clase. Dejo de lado el determinismo económico. ¿Por qué la lucha de clases no puede tener la absoluta centralidad para la Chloe Mouffe? El libro lo publican en el 85, lo escriben desde el 80, 81 en adelante, y es importante marcar la fecha, porque era una fecha donde existía la Unión Soviética, existían los 2 grandes bloques político-militares de la OTAN y el Pacto de Varsovia, pero también existía un reexamen de lo que es la capacidad explicativa del marxismo, de las luchas que surgieron con más fuerza en la década del 60 y 70, de ahí en adelante. Las luchas por la igualdad de género, de las preferencias sexuales, de la igualdad racial, etc. Entonces, la Chloe Mouffe, de repente, al decir, y presentaron un muy buen argumento basado en Foucault acerca de posiciones de sujeto para poder eliminar el esencialismo del sujeto y el reduccionismo de clase. Yo aplaudo eso y creo que todos deberíamos aplaudirlo, especialmente si uno trabaja con movimientos indígenas, con distintas variantes de feminismo, distintas variantes de antirracismo. Pero el problema que encontré es otro, y lo descubrí solo años después. Fue tanto, permítame darles una metáfora. En la tesis doctoral de Luis Althusser, que fue en el año 75, una tesis doctoral que ya no existe, el doctorado de Estado. Althusser dice que para enderezar un bastón es necesario doblar la madera en el lado opuesto. Con lo cual siempre se corren dos riesgos. No lo doblas lo suficiente o lo doblas en exceso. Ninguna de las dos te sirve. Y me da la impresión que el impacto que tuvo el trabajo de la Chloe Mouffe, en parte por ellos, pero en parte también de cómo fue recibido su trabajo entre sus lectores, fue tal el énfasis que hicieron en, hasta hoy, cualquier seguidor de la Chloe Mouffe van a decir, y hay que ir en contra del reduccionismo de clase, etc. Fue tal el énfasis de cuestionar el reduccionismo de clase que el concepto de clase desapareció. Y eso para mí es una de las debilidades grandes de la manera en que fue recibida la teorización post-marxista de la Chloe Mouffe. ¿Por qué es un problema? Porque empezó a colonizar el espacio del debate progresista. No quiero decir siquiera izquierda, no voy a hablar de marxismo. Algo un poco más difuso, que sería el lenguaje de los progres. El progresismo quedó asociado con la defensa, basta ver el trabajo de Nancy Fraser, que en su crítica a Habermas dice, Habermas se equivoca. A menos que hayamos resuelto el problema de la división de clases, de raza, de género y las preferencias sexuales, nunca va a haber una esfera pública democrática. En otras palabras, la sociedad liberada era condición de posibilidad para futuras liberaciones. ¿Qué problemas tiene esto? ¿Qué problemas nos causa a nosotros? Les doy un ejemplo. Una de las movilizaciones más extraordinarias que nos tocó vivir recientemente fue la movilización chilena de octubre del 2019. Generó esperanzas extraordinarias en América Latina de que una de las marchas llegó a tener 1 millón de personas frente a la Plaza de la Dignidad, la vieja Plaza Italia, que la redenominaron Plaza de la Dignidad. Fueron tan exitosos con el problema de la pandemia que vino un par de meses después, fueron tan exitosos que convencieron, después de casi 40 años de transición democrática, que finalmente habría una convención constituyente. Ahora, ¿qué pasó en la convención constituyente? Dudo que la mayoría de los constituyentes haya sabido quién eran la Chloe Mouffe, dudo que hayan leído a la Chloe Mouffe, pero fueron los que fueron electos, o el grueso de los que fueron electos sobre la base de temas identitarios e insistieron mucho en los derechos de los pueblos, del pueblo mapuche, la igualdad de género, las opciones sexuales, etcétera, etcétera. Para los observadores eso fue un fracaso. Para cualquier persona con 2 dedos de frente fue un fracaso. ¿Cómo se mide el fracaso en esto? Que el 60 y tantos % del electorado rechazó la Constitución. ¿Por qué la rechazó? Porque el grueso de las demandas que habían surgido al calor de la lucha en octubre del 2019 eran demandas relacionadas con lo que acá se llama las afores, que las afores es una política que fue introducida por el gobierno de Pinochet para generar dinero disponible para créditos bajos para los empresarios, con la promesa de que uno podría jubilar con 70, 75, 80% de los sueldos. Lo que no explicaron era que eso dependía del estado del mercado. Entonces hay gente, mi hermano por ejemplo, que se va a jubilar con el 20%, después de contribuir durante 35 años, se va a jubilar con el 20% del ingreso de los últimos 5 años. Entonces la gente decía no más AFP, que fue una de las consignas, decía la meritocracia, fue una mentira, porque para que funcione la meritocracia necesitas un piso de juego parejo que no hay en el mercado. Decían de que nos pidieron que estudiemos para poder ascender socialmente, pero luego descubrieron de que hay universidades patitos y universidades formales. Y las nuevas universidades tenían problemas en poder meter a sus egresados en el mercado laboral, pero sus egresados ya estaban endeudados, o sus familias estaban endeudadas para pagar lo caro que es el estudio de la universidad en Chile. Entonces, ¿cuáles eran las demandas? ¿A qué se refieren estas demandas? No más AFP, es decir, no más afores. Queremos un salario digno, queremos trabajos que nos permitan realizarnos a nosotros mismos y no simples malos trabajos para tratar de llegar a fines de mes. Lo que están planteando ahí es un tema de igualdad, o más bien de desigualdad, que yo lo asociaría con el concepto de clase y con lucha de clases. Entendiendo, y no voy a entrar en esto, que el concepto de lucha de clases para el comienzo del siglo XX ya no puede basarse en la centralidad obrera y tampoco puede necesariamente restringirse a un proyecto anticapitalista, que es lo que caracterizó el proyecto de Marx y la manera como fue asimilado por las distintas tribus marxistas. Entonces, la pregunta es, muy bien por el posmarxismo, es necesario. Marx ya murió hace más de 150 años. Seguimos impresionados por su obra y más que nada por la lectura que hizo Derrida, que no nos habla de recuperar a Marx, nos habla de recuperar distintos espectros de Marx, ver cómo Marx puede seguir presente en la crítica a la desigualdad, la crítica al capitalismo, etc. Pero les pregunto, ¿qué hacemos cuando celebramos el posmarxismo como la teoría de los estudios culturales, y los estudios culturales se definen por la sagrada trinidad de la clase, género y raza? ¿Qué hacemos cuando tenemos una demanda igualitaria? ¿Qué hacemos cuando, no sé si hay economistas acá, cuando el índice Gini es más de 0,48 o está en 0,50? Uno de los índices más altos, no tengo actualizada la información, es el de Dinamarca, que es 0,23. Mientras más alto el Gini, más desigual la sociedad. Mientras más bajo, más igualitaria. Entonces, ¿qué hacemos para poder pasar de 0,48 a 0,35? Eso tiene que ver con temas de igualdad. Y me temo que la manera como fue recibida esa extraordinaria crítica del esencialismo de clase, reduccionismo de clase de la Chloe Mouffe, llevó a dejar de lado la preocupación por el tema igualitario. No lo diría en México, diría al contrario. Al contrario, acá se ha dado, por lo menos desde 2018, se ha dado más énfasis a elementos de igualdad, no siempre muy bien hecho, pero se le ha dado más énfasis al tema de la igualdad que en prácticamente todos los países de América Latina, excepto Colombia y excepto Brasil. Entonces, mi primera pregunta, aunque nadie haya pensado que era una sola pregunta, mi primera pregunta es, desde el punto de vista de los estudios culturales, que me parece muy bien que diga en su presentación que ya no hay que hablar de estudios culturales, sino que cultura o estudios sobre cultura. ¿Qué va a ser los estudios culturales que se define como postmarxista o cómo va a encontrar un camino para incorporar la igualdad dentro de su reflexión? Esa es la primera pregunta, Paul. Como entendiste todo, no necesito traducir.
¿Hay una pregunta en inglés o en catalán?
What do you say about post-Marxism? Gracias. ¿Más detalle? Ella sabe, ya hablamos de esto, así que entiende. La segunda pregunta tiene que ver también con la idea de hegemonía y poshegemonía. ¿Quién de nosotros no habla de la hegemonía de Morena en relación con sus aliados? ¿Quién de nosotros nos habla de la hegemonía del pensamiento de la derecha en Estados Unidos? Pero eso no es lo que pensaban la Chloe Mouffe sobre hegemonía. Ellos fueron más allá de lo que es el uso cotidiano del concepto de hegemonía y le dieron un uso parecido al de Gramsci, pero reformulado. Lo plantearon como una práctica articulatoria que modifica aquello que articula, genera cadenas de equivalencias, establece fronteras entre nosotros y ellos sobre la base de algún tipo de antagonismo. Eso es hegemonía para ellos. No están contentos con Gramsci por los resabios reduccionistas que quedan en Gramsci. Por otro lado, no hay que olvidar que Gramsci era secretario general del Partido Comunista y Gramsci no iba a decir yo soy postmarxista avant la lettre, sería absurdo. Pero sí hay que preguntarse cuán útil es el concepto de hegemonía más tecnificado como el que nos proponen el postmarxismo de Laclau y Mouffe. Y les digo por lo siguiente. ¿Cómo ocurre buena parte de la política en los países de Europa Occidental? A través de los ciclos electorales. ¿Cómo pensó Gramsci la idea de la hegemonía? Él lo que planteó es que, y Laclau y Mouffe citan precisamente esta frase, él planteó de que una clase no toma el poder del Estado, una clase deviene Estado. Y deviene Estado porque ya empieza a luchar en las instituciones generadoras de consenso para ir transformando la narrativa interna. ¿Quién entendió esto muy bien? La ultraderecha. Hay un señor que todos deberíamos detestar que se llama Agustín Laje, que publicó un libro. Antes de lo del libro, Agustín Laje en una de las entrevistas dice: el gran error de la derecha fue nunca haber leído a Gramsci. ¿Por qué? Porque Gramsci nos da pistas para algo que siempre se nos escapó como importante, que era la lucha cultural. Sin la lucha cultural no vamos a ganar corazones, no vamos a ganar elecciones. Y les ha funcionado muy bien, excepto que, claro, son barbaridades que dice. Construye el feminismo como una especie de caballo de Troya de la nueva izquierda para meter sus ideas en los estudiantes. Hay que pelear contra eso. La traducción que hacen los seguidores de Trump al respecto es vamos a tirarnos en contra de la ideología woke. La ideología woke tiene definiciones, pero el uso que se hace en el discurso político de la palabra woke es suficientemente elástico para poder meter muchísimas cosas más que la corrección política, la política de la identidad, el uso de ciertas palabras, la prohibición de otras palabras, etc. Bueno, Laje sí entendió de qué trataba Gramsci, por qué nos era importante. Pero lo que Laje no tematizó es lo mismo que no tematizó Gramsci y es lo mismo que no tematizaron Laclau y Mouffe, que es el hecho que cuando Gramsci dice una clase deviene Estado y no toma el poder del Estado, él está asumiendo de que la clase se va a convertir en el nuevo Estado. Pero ¿cómo funciona la política entre nosotros? A través de ciclos electorales. Esa es la pregunta que quiero hacer a la gente que quiere seguir usando el concepto de hegemonía. Yo lo uso, pero prefiero usarlo en los términos coloquiales. La fuerza dominante, las ideas dominantes, la narrativa que tiene más peso, etc. ¿Qué hacemos cuando no se trata de devenir Estado, sino que se trata de competir cada 4 años, cada 5 años, cada 6 años, por ver quién tiene el acceso a la conducción del poder ejecutivo de un país? ¿Por qué esto es importante? ¿Por qué la idea de desplazar el terreno de la discusión de la hegemonía a los ciclos electorales es importante? Porque los ciclos electorales son, no sé qué porcentaje, pero son una parte importante de lo que pasa por política en nuestras sociedades. Y en los ciclos electorales hay algo sorprendente que puede ocurrir, puedes perder. Ahora, ¿qué pasa si pierdes? Boric en Chile acaba de perder, pero perdió no solamente, que bueno, así es este negocio, a veces se gana, a veces se pierde, no es tan sencillo como eso. El que ganó es el hijo de un oficial, no me acuerdo si era de la Gestapo o de la SS. Es un hombre que creció pensando de que lo hicieron bien. El único problema es que los detuvieron. Cast.
Necesitamos dejar tiempo para que la gente pueda hacer preguntas a Paul también.
¿Me estás castigando por llegar tarde? Ok, entonces, tenía 4 puntos por desarrollar, lo dejo en 2. Los 2 serían la idea de postmarxismo, ¿qué hacemos para pensar un postmarxismo donde el tema de la igualdad, no igualdad en el sentido de abolir todos los medios, la propiedad privada de los medios de producción, la dictadura del proletariado y cosas así, sino que pensar qué es lo que significa vivir en sociedades altamente desiguales? No solamente desiguales a nivel de género, raza o preferencia sexual, sino que somos muy desiguales en términos de podemos comprar la canasta mínima que el INEGI define como la línea de la pobreza. Un pequeño dato que les doy. La UNAM hizo, el Instituto de Economía de la UNAM hizo un estudio. Y el estudio tomaron como las dos fechas de corte fueron 1987 y 2017. Y lo que calcularon es que un trabajador que ganaba el sueldo mínimo en 1987 necesitaba trabajar 4 horas y fracción para comprar la canasta mínima. 30 años después, y de acuerdo, no me acuerdo si era el Banco Mundial o el Fondo Monetario, que indican que la productividad promedio por trabajador en México en esos 30 años subió 450%. Bueno, el estudio concluye que en el 2017 ese mismo trabajador tenía que trabajar 24 horas y fracción para comprar esa misma canasta básica. Eso es algo que se tiene que enfrentar y eso es algo que me parece que es un área que no ha sido desarrollada, punto. Más que otro comentario, pero no hay ningún trabajo de los postmarxistas para tematizar lo que Paul ve como la teoría de los estudios culturales de la Chloe Mouffe, que es pensar en clase, perdón, dice clase, pero no lo veo tanto lo de clase, género y raza. Creo que lo que tendría que haber colocado es preferencias sexuales más que clase. Y la segunda pregunta es, cuando estamos insertos en procesos electorales, ¿puede funcionar la concepción de hegemonía que heredamos de Gramsci y que fue reformulada por Laclau y por Mouffe, sabiendo que se puede perder? Es decir, no es simplemente la idea de una revolución victoriosa que no va a tener desafíos. Va a ser una victoria, porque se han aceptado las reglas de juego electorales, va a ser una victoria electoral que puede ser revertida. Gracias.
¿Alguien quiere hacer preguntas a Paul o a Benjamín? Así como para recoger a lo mejor unas 2 o 3.
Que use el palo.
Sí, va a
Your stick.
Walk around with a stick to see who's going to In a non-threatening way.
In a non-threatening.
¿Alguna pregunta, comentario?
Perdón, ofrezco 25 pesos para que se atreva a hacer la primera pregunta.
Yareni, cortita y en inglés para Paul, por favor.
Okay, I'm going to try it in English, but if I can't, I will ask for help, right? So,
Pues voy a intentar en inglés.
my question is about the background of the critical theory and its link with Alex Karp. Dígese rápido.
No, pero es por la traducción.
Okay.
Y aquí te mandan 25 pesos por hacer la primera pregunta.
Ya tengo para el camión de regreso, gracias.
Sí, micrófono, por favor.
Okay. Entonces, my question is about the background about the critical theory and
Bueno,
its
es sobre el
link,
antecedente de la teoría crítica
and its link with Alex Karp and this evil corporation called Palantir, and how
por ejemplo, con Alex Carr y Palantir.
the cultural studies can address that issue, which is like really urgent.
¿Qué nos podría comentar sobre este tema que es tan urgente?
So, shall I Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So,
But I think you have to use the microphone for
Okay.
the ones that are.
I will do that. So, yes? Okay. I think your question is a question
Bueno, a
In-
ver si entendí. Creo que es una pregunta sobre
about intervention, about how
Una pregunta sobre
it's a
intervención.
very old and long-running question about
O sea, es una pregunta
the
que
relationship
creo que es de
between
larga data, ¿no? La relación entre
between an academic work and urgent issues in the world. And this was formulated very nicely by Stuart Hall, writing in the immediate context of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And he says something like, against the urgency of people dying in the streets, what the hell is the point of cultural studies? And I think that the answer is kind of a Gramscian one. And Stuart Hall, who I always look to for thinking about cultural studies, always insisted that we have to work on more than one front at the same time. So we have to understand that even though academic written work published in a journal or something, it might not seem like it's going to the barricades or marching in the streets or doing some kind of intervention. It's not either or. It should be also and. So we shouldn't think that academic work is not political, but that marching in the streets is political. They are both different forms of work, of political effort. So I think that there's lots of kind of implicit theories of what is intervention and what should a scholar do, what should academics do. And there was a long-held belief in the power of critique. So like, let's critique, let's speak truth to power, let's point out that something is racist, let's point out that something is sexist. But I don't think we always have that much faith that's going to make any difference to anything. So it's a question of trying to work out the destination of anything. How do you fight against just it being pointless, just another article in like for the ref, which we all hate because it's so boring and it makes us kind of become career obsessed. I think that academic work can contribute in a diverse, heterogeneous, multiple way. We need to think about our institutional location and don't discount our own voices and think, oh, well, this is just me speaking in a conference or this is just me publishing in a journal article, because that is also a contribution to perhaps a struggle or a movement. But there are also the many other spaces in society where we can use our voice or we can try to intervene in different ways. So I think the problem for any academic, for anyone who really cares, is to not just go, well, I'll do my academic work, and that's very interesting, and then I'll go marching in the streets. We need to work out how can I work strategically and responsibly to try to... This is why Derrida, I like Derrida. I like Derrida a lot because for Derrida, there's always the perhaps. This event here, perhaps it's nothing, but perhaps something happens here that changes directions and destinies and so on. So the short answer is, it's also and think about the hegemonic institutional location, which speaks to my interest. The way I relate to sort of Laclauian theory and post-Marxist theory and political theory is that it gives you a very, to use the words that were used by an American philosopher called Richard Rorty. Richard Rorty would argue that the point of a theory or anything is to describe things in a way that seems right, and I think that Laclau and Mouffe and discourse theory and Antonio Gramsci describe things in a way that seems right, and sometimes it seems wrong, like the ways you've pointed out, like this stuff about hegemony. What about the electoral process, and what about these different institutional mechanisms that subvert the idea of a hegemonic bloc or so on? But I think that thinking about our place within a socially kind of articulated network of nodes is really important. I could talk about this too long, and I still haven't answered your question, but that would be the way I would advocate thinking about it. Okay.
Voy a recoger las tres.
If you could use your stick. No. Considering your definition of cultural studies as a theoretical and political intervention, how is the scope of such an intervention transformed when operating within the structures of the neoliberal university in the global south, specifically in contexts like Mexico, where academic precarity and the pressure of economic utility threaten to neutralize maybe the disruptive potential of studying supposedly trivial objects like martial arts?
Oh, give me a second, I'm going to pass another question.
Hi. So my question would be, more within martial arts studies, what would be the prevalence of serious practitioners who are also within martial arts studies, I guess, because some of these studies I've looked at are done often from an outsider perspective, and those that are done within the field are sort of hagiographic or very justificatory of, like, for example, and what I'm interested in, Kendo studies in Japanese are mostly done as a way to base a lineage of Japanese spirit within the Japanese nation. So they are hardly critical of their own topic of study, unless it's done by outsiders. Is that a problem where people within, I suppose it's the same in every single discipline, where people within a field may not be very keen to disrupt their own social standing within a group? Is that a problem that you've encountered within the journal, for example?
Okay. 2 questions or 3? Okay.
The last one, then you go.
Okay, thank you first for the presentation. So when I was hearing you, Paul, I start to think about that cultural studies can be also like a way of living. I don't know if that makes sense, but when you talked about how every object can be thought in the political and ethical sense, then for me that it's like every action, everything that you do can have that openness and can have that step back of critique and see what you are doing, and that's how I thought of it, as some sort of way of living instead of something that only lives in the academia, right? And in that sense, I am thinking that that could become like a common sense of living, and in that sense, we would get rid of those reactionary actions and I don't know, appeal. Thinking that I would want to appeal to the cultural studies as a way of living in some sort of common sense. And I say that because also I see that the right wing always appeals to the common sense, right? Like it's obvious that this is not right. It's obvious that this is, you see it in Argentina or just in Chile. Like when you see comments on YouTube, it's like there's not even space for debate because it's obvious that the things are supposed to be working like that. So my question would be: is it possible that, or do you see the possibility that this way of thinking with the stick and openness and the Lego bricks and all of that could become a common sense in some sort, or even if that is desirable? I don't know if you think that is desirable, but well, that's my question.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. So the Marxist criticism, Hart and Negri Marxists in Empire, is that a Marxist book?
They claim that they are following the heritage of Marx.
Okay, so the criticism of cultural studies in Empire, which was a big deal when it came out. I don't know what we think about it now, but People like Hart and Negri, there are other Marxists are available, Slavoj Žižek, for instance, would argue that cultural studies is neoliberal ideology, right? The Marxist criticism of cultural studies is that it thinks it's progressive and it's been allowed to flourish precisely because it's neoliberalist common sense, and that it enables the expansion of markets, and so cultural studies should flourish in a neoliberal university because, you know, what do young adults want? They want to do whatever they want. Where can you do whatever you want? In cultural studies. Okay, pay your fees, get your debt, have your fun, right? And this is connected to questions, I suppose, of cultural value. I'm not sure I follow all of the nuances of your question about cultural value, but maybe we can chat later about specifically what you're asking about kendo. And whether martial arts studies is trivial. Is cultural studies trivial? Is cultural studies serious? Is martial arts studies trivial? Is it serious? Are the things that we care passionately about, like the thing that is absolutely most important to me every day when I wake up is, can I go training today? Like, that's fundamental, but viewed in many perspectives, that's just trivial. So this taking seriously that dimension of everyday life, is that more or less serious, and should it be more or less valued than talking about political economy and hegemony and so on? So again, my answer would be this deconstructive one where it's not either or, it should be also and. I think that I don't know, I don't want to talk about the global south because I think that I don't know enough about the global south. That's why I looked pleadingly at Benjamin when you talked about Mexico and the global south, and I wondered if Benjamin might want to say something about any of these issues. So yes, cultural studies is an ideology, and cultural studies is an ideology that, and martial arts studies can be called trivial. So when I started writing about Bruce Lee, my head of school was quite despairing of it, because before that I was writing about serious things, manly things, ideology, politics, Zizek, Badiou, Rancière, blah blah blah, Laclau and Mouffe, serious manly stuff, right? And then I started writing about Bruce Lee films. Like, what the hell are you doing? And he was like, nah, it's kind of like, nah. And I was like, no, it's a big deal. It's really, really important. And there is an ongoing, interminable battle between what do we value and why do we value it, which I think might touch the edges of your question slightly. Do you want to say anything about this?
I was just thinking that everybody's fascinated with your sticks.
Yep.
Do you know that there's...
It's not mine. I didn't bring this through like in hand luggage.
No, but I was thinking of your talk could be teach Derrida and carry a big stick.
Yeah, tread softly and carry a big stick. Yeah, we can talk more later, I guess. Okay.
Esteban, respondiendo tu pregunta.
¿Más preguntas?
Okay.
Thank you both so much. I was curious to ask you, Paul, about your sense in your own university, whether these changes in and around the nomination cultural studies and the wider question of the humanities, whether that entails a fundamental mutation of the university as such, as an institution, in your immediate context, or whether you think this is more of a, quite large and important, but still fairly regional change.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I think that I think that if someone like Lyotard in the Postmodern Condition, which was published in 1979, I think it was an incredibly prescient work. It seemed radical and crazy, but actually, if you look at that now, I think Lyotard describes what the university is like. And I think if you can one of my slides was the cover from The University in Ruins, because it was a book by Bill Reddings, in which he argued that what he called the University of Excellence That's what the research excellence framework measures, excellence. And it's a non-referential category. It's a kind of, it's empty. It doesn't mean anything. But so you score 4 out of 4. That's excellent. Okay, great. That means, anyway. So if you combine, say, Lyotard's description of knowledge in a postmodern society, and the university becomes organized by isolated, he calls them paralogical islands, where it doesn't matter what is done within it, as long as they're in some way productive for something, that could be, capitalized upon in other ways. And Bill Reddings argues the same thing in his 1997 book, I think it was 97, possibly later, The University in Ruins, where the university no longer cares what you do as long as it's excellent, right? And that's definitely the case in my sphere of experience of the university, which is by definition local and British. But I think that interdisciplinarity, porterdisciplinarity, postdisciplinarity is a common thing, and I kind of argued provocatively that cultural studies illustrates, and it's almost like the advanced shock troops of what was going to happen more generally in the university. However, there's a flip side to that argument, and then there's an argument that things became cultural studies as a way to just preserve the study of capital L literature, capital P philosophy, capital A art. And it was called cultural studies and slightly repackaged and rebranded so that it didn't die when people wanted to deconstruct or decolonize even the curriculum. So I think it's probably a force that is probably a neoliberal force that is moving through universities, but I don't know enough about university context, say, in Mexico to comment in an informed way about that. That's what I think.
Thank you, Paul, for your presentation, and also Benjamin for the points that you raised, among them the critique of, I think it was economic reductionism, which is a valuable thing in post-Marxism. And I would like to maybe interpret what you argued in your presentation, Paul, as an argument against reductionism, not just economic reductionism, but also political reductionism. And try to connect it with something you said earlier to me, like, okay, maybe physical culture, for example, is part of an industry, of a fitness industry, but it's not just that, right? And you recognize that cultural studies might be and work as an ideology, but it's not just that. No? I found it very provocative when you said, okay, there is some resonance between intervention as always pursued by cultural studies and impact as in the ref, right? So that's a provocation, I think. It's a way of recognizing cultural studies implication in everything else, but without being reductionist in the sense that that's all there is and there is nothing else, right? So maybe I would like to hear something about the difference between intervention, critical intervention, and impact. Because to me it sounds a bit like symptomatic of this hegemonic theory of cultural studies, that we can only think about intervention in terms of, I don't know, building a state or doing like this electoral impact, for example, right? And I don't think intervention is that. You've talked about minor politics, you've talked about, thinking, you didn't say locally, but I heard, something about being like radically contextual, which is how people here in Latin America introduce the Stuart Hall tradition of cultural studies, being radically contextual, which also means to me, like not being reductionist, deterministic, and so forth. So what is in the end the difference between intervention and impact in your view, like maybe in your local context, you know? Because here I have ways of thinking about, for example, impact is about metrics, right? It's about metrics, you know, likes and citations, as Benjamin was saying.
Okay. So impact in the ref, right? Impact is where you've done something, right? Like you maybe had a conference, or maybe you've invented something, a patent, or you wrote an article. You did something academic that changed something in the world. Maybe, maybe you did it. So, for instance, maybe you did a study of the language used in a news broadcaster like the BBC or the Times or something like that, and you demonstrate that it's biased in a certain way, and then maybe your academic article is published, your report's published, and then the BBC or the Times go, oh shit, yeah, you're right, we'll change that, and then you write a follow-up study that says, so you see how that's impact, that's really significant impact. The research funding councils think that have it a slightly more vague and shifting thing. So like my martial arts studies grant was, I'll bring academics and martial artists together so that we enrich and also I'll bring people from different disciplines together to have a shared conversation. That's a kind of research council impact. But I think that in the face of what the ref defines as impact and what people in cultural studies actually do. Because if in cultural studies I do something that is, you might call like a minor politics, like I know it's important, but it's important in a way that barely registers or might seem invisible. It's not like coming up with a new patent or a new argument that changes legislation or something like that. I think that cultural studies occupies this kind of idealist but fundamentally tricky situation. The best example of a real intervention, I think, would be, so in the UK there was this terrible racist murder. It was the Stephen Lawrence murder. This poor guy was killed for no reason at a bus stop by some racists, and then the subsequent handling of the entire process by the London Metropolitan Police was a disgrace. So there was an investigation, and it was called the Lawrence Inquiry. Stuart Hall was on that committee that investigated that, and that committee produced the concept of institutional racism. When we talk about institutional racism, it comes from cultural studies. It's a concept that would always have made sense in a kind of Foucauldian, Gramscian context, but it goes out into the world and causes a radical, maybe decolonization, or at least a radical kind of interrogation of the London Metropolitan Police, one that has ramifications for processes and changes institutions. Now that's not impact, that is intervention, that is a significant intervention in the world. So there's a difference there, I think. I think that cultural studies is not always in a good position to perform the kind of intervention that it fantasizes about. And I think that you say that, like, there's a resonance between the ref, impact, and cultural studies. And my provocative argument is that ultimately you could go, oh, that's a kind of Hart and Negri, Zizek, anti-cultural studies argument that says that cultural studies is there's the shock troops of neoliberalism that's deconstructing the university, decolonizing the curriculum, and that is all part of this energy that we should be very, very resistant to. So I kind of like playing with that because it might well be that, but it's not just that, as you say. Do you want to say anything about that?
No, I was just thinking that it sounds as if the cultural studies is a matrix.
Matrix.
Yeah, because neoliberalism is the matrix because everything continues to strengthen it, and I have reservations about that.
Yeah.
Everybody, todos conocen esto de que si dice de que todo lo que clase de estudio cultural y post-marxismo refuerza el neoliberalismo, significa que el neoliberalismo es una especie de monstruo que se alimenta de cualquier cosa y sigue creciendo y creciendo independientemente de lo que hagamos. My problem with that kind of thinking is that it's very difficult to think about resistance. If everything contributes to the system, then perhaps the most revolutionary thing is let's watch TV.
Yeah, no, but I take that kind of Marxist argument on board as a challenge, but I agree with what Gabriella is saying, is that you can have like kind of, it had like resistance and politics is local and contextual and conjunctural. We to see whatever we mean by conjunctural. And I think that that's also what I'm arguing for. I think that for me, Marxism and the Marxist theory, especially the kind of really straight down the line stuff of like someone like Slavoj Žižek, who formalizes it in extremis, right? I always have that as a worst case scenario. Like, how can you have, what would the most pessimistic negative evaluation of this be? So Hart and Negri's most negative evaluation of cultural studies is that it is neoliberal. Feminism, anti-racism, and all this stuff is the movement of neoliberal ideology through the institution. So I once taught cultural studies with a Marxist historian. We shared the lectures, and he said, all this radical theory, it's essentially we're just teaching common sense to the masses. We're teaching, like, what is radical theory? It's be nice to each other. Like, be nice. You're all equal. Why not be nice? And he's like, this isn't radical. This is what Slavoj Žižek says when he says that Derrida, cultural studies, post-structuralism is neoliberal common sense. And so I don't accept that, but I take it as a challenge. Like, okay, in what ways might that be wrong? And what happens if it is right? If it's right, does it stay right? Is that all it means? Is that all there is? So this is my relationship with Marxism is like that. Like, and I become Marxist sometimes when I feel that people are being too celebratory of the advance of feminism or study of popular culture or something like that.
But how do you respond to those who say that everything you do in cultural studies strengthens neoliberalism? How do you counter that kind of argument? What would be your counter-argument?
I would counter it with the Stephen Lawrence, Stuart Hall kind of production of well, the one that the example of the birth of the concept of institutional racism, for example, is something that there are other examples like this where you could argue that cultural studies. I think you're right about the kind of the waning of an attention to equality and to questions of class. Like I said in my presentation, that cultural studies used to be interested in race, class, gender, or sexuality, and I think you're right. Class has fallen off the agenda, and it might be a consequence of post-Marxist theory and postmodern theory. But I would dispute that. I would accumulate examples to show that, and I don't buy the totalizing argument. Anyway, I just use it as it's a problem for myself,
So we have one last question.
Yeah.
We have one last question, and then we can continue the conversation outside because there is food and drinks and all of that.
Okay. I'm so sorry for my English, so I'm going to try it. So I'd like to ask you about writing. You say that defining factors are gender, class, and race. And none of that is external to the body, or rather, they are ways of reading bodies. Outside of these parameters for measuring excellence and neoliberalism, like you said about the affects, you mentioned it at the end of your presentation. And I was thinking when Benjamin, we were talk, if the right wins and wants to discipline or affects, how can we as a bodies write theory ethically and politically? What paths have you found? How do you conceive of your own writing?
So my own writing about the body and about ideology and so on. Well, my current struggle, my current challenge is to work out how to put into words embodied experiences, because I think there's a really complicated process of translation that takes place in that. So I think that in order to write about the body and about embodiment and anything phenomenological and the kind of affective structure of things like exercise or martial arts, you have to be anti-disciplinary. I think you have to be really working very hard to combine as many theoretical perspectives and philosophical questions and literary techniques to capture that. So I think there's an anti-disciplinarity there. I think that when I read studies of embodiment that are written in the social sciences, in sport studies, it's so formalized that it's so kind of ugly and horrible, and it seems to, you know, the expression throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like it loses the thing it's trying to do. And I think that the real challenge is to capture in a literary or aesthetic or artistic manner, to translate it into the written word is a real challenge, and it's one that I'm currently trying to explore. Was there a question in there about ideology and affect as well? Or
Yes, it's like how do you write with thinking about your affects and with with ethic in cultural studies.
Okay. That's a complicated question. I think that I mean, there's an awful lot to say about it, and we're over time. Let me think, and let me talk to you if you're still having the food and drink. But if not, I apologize for leaving that question hanging, and thank you, and I'm sorry to let you down. Sorry to disappoint everyone.
Pues muchísimas gracias, thank you Paul, y gracias Benjamín Arditi, y gracias a ustedes por asistir, por escuchar, y quienes se animaron y se atrevieron también por participar. Aquí afuera hay un brindis que ofrece el Departamento de Filosofía, ojalá que se puedan quedar un ratito y podamos saludarnos, y si quieren platicar un poquito más con Paul, pues también. Paul, people are asking for you to use the stick, so maybe... No, not now because there's no space here, but maybe outside.
Mañana vamos a tener lo de Tai Chi de construcción con Paul a las 3 aquí en la biblioteca y vamos a usar el palo. Entonces, ¿es a las 3, cierto, Gaby? Es a la 1. A la 1.
El viernes pues el taller es de 1 a 3, yo creo que antes. Podría ser de...
Very different things. This, what the fuck?
That was great. A lo mejor de 11:30 a 2. Me encanta. Exacto. No, es muy chido.
I also talking about your exercise with your students because I am an undergrad student.